Welcome everyone to the first Dean Speaker Series of the year. We're going to be doing more of these throughout the semester. And next year we may partner some with the Museum of Nature and Science to collaborate with some of their speakers in. We also welcome suggestions from folks as well. If there's somebody really great you want to partner with us and bring them in for the Dean Speaker Series, we're happy to do so as well. But today is such a privilege to kick it off with John Samet, for all that he has done for the school and to honor him. I hope that all of you can stay for a reception afterwards. And John, we have put together a gift for you as well to honor your time as Dean. John, as many of you know, is the longest Dean for Colorado School of Public Health. Something he is incredibly proud of. Yeah, I'm starting to get appreciation for that statement. So, he just did so much for the school, and he continues to do so as he serves in an interim capacity for our Department of Environmental and Occupational Health. John certainly needs no introduction, but there are just some things I want to say about all the ways in which he has been acknowledged. He served as the editor and author of Reports with the Surgeon General on Smoking and Health since 1984. He received the Surgeon General's Medallion in 1990 and in 2006 for all of the work that he did. He received the 2004 really cool, Prince Mahidol Award for Global Health awarded by the King of Thailand. The Edward Livingston Trudeau Medal for the American Thoracic Society and American Lung Association. The Luther Terry Award for the Distinguished Career from the American Cancer Society, the Freeze Prize for Health. He received alumni awards from the Harvard School of Public Health and also from the Rochester School of Medicine and Dentistry. And he was elected to the National Academy of Medicine in 1997 and has authored a lot of numerous reports for it, and received the David Rawls Medal in 2015. We are so fortunate to have such a distinguished individual who has served as the Dean of the Colorado School of Public Health and to kick off this series and give us an opportunity to honor him for everything he did. So with that, John, welcome.
Thank you so much for that introduction. You're never going to by the way. But I'm delighted to be here. So let me tell you about what I'm going to talk about. And I picked this topic because we're all concerned about how what we do makes a difference. And air pollution and health is actually something where I can tell you about processes by which we go from science, what we do, to actually having impact. And for much of what we do, it's a little mysterious. If Donna and her team do another study on what happens early in life and future risk, it's going to have impact, but the different tendrils of processes by which that impact occurs are not so clear. But here I'm going to show you some actual processes. I think it's useful because you might notice I have how science does, paren does not. Because when you have a process, then if you know what it is, then you can meddle with the process. So I'm going to talk about what I think the process is, and I don't know very well how it works in the US. And then how those who understand that process can then reach in and try and change it. So that's why we have the title, and that's what I'm going to talk about. I do have one question I'm going to throw out to the audience, one quiz question. Get ready. Somebody has to answer it. The dean is the fallback person to answer the question, so don't be nervous, except for Kathy. With that, let's get going. And first off, remember this definition. I use this all the time in thinking about the environmental world I live in and what our goal is. Our goal is to have risks that we think are acceptable. I mean, ultimately, that's what we want. And this definition comes from a book written in 1977 that was just very sensible about this very complicated topic. And I think there's two pieces then. The thing is safe if its risks are judged to be acceptable. So it's two pieces. You have to know what the risks are. And then you have to make some judgment as to acceptability of this. And I always posit that our job as researchers, if that's what we're doing, is to determine what the risks are and be able to communicate about them. And of course, it's always bounded by some uncertainties. And, you know, we always talk about things, well, the odds ratio is X, but. And, but that's our job. And then the judgment as to acceptability to me is society at large. And it's not necessarily for the researcher to say, well, this turns out to be a lifetime risk of cancer, 1 in X. I think that's acceptable. The acceptability judgment comes elsewhere. So I think that's what we do as researchers and practitioners too are involved in these processes and making these judgments. So how do we decide then where and when we're going to address risk? Well, some risks we might judge are unacceptable for us personally or at the population level. We're all making decisions all the time. You know, do we cross the street against the light? Do we climb this peak? Do we do whatever it is? Do we eat whatever it might be, and so on. And then there's considerations of environmental justice and health equity to figure in. Regulation, the world I live in a lot, where these judgments are being made, and sometimes a bright line on when risks should be addressed. Litigation, very prominent in the United States. You can just watch the ads for lawyers trolling for diet and some other things make it very complicated. And then if there's a path from evidence to action, and then if the broader context, and we'll talk a lot about that, is supportive of action. So, you know, look at our United States world in a moment, and you know, we are so fragmented on environmental issues. So what some might see as sufficiently solid, others may dismiss as junk science. So the world is complicated. So I'm going to throw out a general scheme that, at least in my brisk environmental world, kind of prevails, and you can see if it adopts to yours. So we're left notice, research, generation of evidence on one side, ending in action on the other. And you know, we have all these sort of evidence to action paradigms. We teach them in class. We have all these neat flow diagrams about how the world works, or how we wish the world worked, okay, not how it really works. So research, got some boxes down there. The evidence on risk is there a hazard? And how does that hazard change as we get more of whatever it is that we're worried about? That could be a chemical agent, that could be more fat in the diet, it could be more cigarettes per day or whatever. Susceptibility, and we're all have different types of susceptibility, vulnerability, by which I mean, are you exposed more because of who you are? You know, do you live in Globeville versus living in whatever else? So vulnerability, and then understanding what the risks are. We might do that formally or informally. That's right. And again, one of our overall big surprise to see right here in front, Glenn. And you know, what are our findings is the literature. Okay, and there are reasons that it's there. And then, you know, piling up again, systematic review has become very important as a translational step. And you know, we have folks in the room who are experts in systematic review. systematic reviews are sort of proceeding at an ever escalating pace because of the demand for it. It's a way to say what it is we actually know. And then how do we judge that evidence, and what are the ways that we decide that A causes B? And then moving on to looking at risks and understanding risk for whom, who does these assessments, and the roles of different agencies. And some things that we worry about in the environment, there's just a host of engaged agencies in a very confused landscape. And when you get out to action into the real world, there's multiple people engaged, multiple places, and this is a non-scientific realm. And when I cross over into that realm, say testifying in Congress, I know I'm outside of my world and I'm in somebody else's. And it's very critical to sort of understand what world I have stepped into. So the example I'm going to use now for this general paradigm is air pollution. I'm going to talk about outdoor air pollution. And I will say my own personal career story was that air pollution was incredibly bad when I was growing up and when I was sort of thinking about what I wanted to do. And I was very influenced by some of these seminal events like the Cuyahoga River fire in 1969, when the river at Cleveland caught on fire and couldn't be extinguished for several months. And those of us who were around then will remember, for example, the New York City brownouts, people deaths being counted. So it was good. The other picture was what I saw at my hotel room in 2013. And it was a air pollution episode bad enough to make the front page of the Daily Times, which was really bad. My first view of Denver, a long time ago, I came here to a meeting of something called the National Air Conservation Commission that Senator Hart had arranged. Coming in from staying with a friend in Loveland, there truly was a not brown cloud, but a black cloud over the city. And I was talking for a while to the Women's Tennis Association. This was their concern. What about playing tennis in that in Beijing? Okay. Again, and the athletes were practicing 4+ hours a day, breathing in massive quantities of pollution. So this is the problem I'm going to talk about. And here's our paradigm. And I'm going to show you actually for air pollution, this is sort of what is following. Okay, so we're going to go through a little bit of that story. Now, why do we worry about air pollution? It used to be horribly bad, and the body counts were visible. And I'll show you the London fog in a moment. There was an episode in 1932 in the Meuse Valley in Germany. People died. There was a comment in this paper by Firkin and others that if this were to occur in London, thousands would be killed. And of course, it later did occur in London. Sonora, Pennsylvania, in the United States, 1948. Again, I think a handful of people by count, but in a very small community, I think 8 or 9 deaths. So there was reminders early on of the potential to kill. And this really goes back centuries, the concerns about, particularly London, with widespread industry, residential coal burning. I lived right in the heart of downtown Baltimore. 11 years of my home, an old row house going back into the 19th century, had a coal chute in front. Of course, not in use, but the coal trucks would come by and download the coal right into the homes. So this is the London fog of 1952. The Monet quote, this comes from when they had the Monet show in the Denver Museum, Art Museum, and it caught my attention because a lot of his beautiful London scenes, of course, were air pollution, and the colors caught in the air pollution. So this is the London fog of 1952. You can see sulfur oxide smoke, the same as particles. If you notice the scale, it's milligrams. And right now, the annual standard in the United States is 12 micrograms. On an annual basis, 25 on a daily basis. So these are levels, a couple of orders of magnitude greater than what we see. But you can do ocular time series analysis here, I hope. And I think probably reach the conclusion that air pollution caused deaths. You are looking at 10,000 plus extra deaths and 47 data points. Okay. So only 47 data points to tell this story because it was such a whopping catastrophe. And for those of you who watched The Crown, there was an episode in season 1, if you'll remember, season 1, episode 4, which of course I paid great attention to. It was very interesting what Churchill had to say about it. So over time, we've spent a lot of effort looking at air pollution and health. And I would just say we've gone to increasingly sophisticated approaches. Early on, there was sort of like a lot of sort of what is health in a clean city versus the dirty city in terms of air pollution. Very simple ecological studies, simple time series studies, really getting at what are the adverse health effects of air pollution. Then things became much more sophisticated. You must come on down. I'll ask you a question, of course. Sit down there anyway. And the Harvard began what is now called the 6-city study. Of course, the Harvard 6-city study, because everything that comes from Harvard is connected to Harvard. But this study was pioneering because they did very careful understanding of what people were exposed to. Actually, one of the early interesting findings was that smoking in homes is the dominant source of exposure to particles. Really first important evidence of that. And then came cohort of 1 billion people from the American Cancer Society, a study that my colleagues at USC carried out, which was a health study, and then more. We began to get very good about trying to understand what people were exposed to, putting monitors on people, children carrying around backpacks with pumps in them, and we began to look at how did risk vary with their exposure. So more sophisticated studies began this wave of time series studies going beyond the London fog, taking clouds of data and trying to sort things out on a day-to-day basis, how air pollution is affecting health. And then began multi-site studies, drawing together very large databases. And I'll show you how this has gone global with very large studies. And now we're doing national cohorts. So for example, in Europe, Canada, countries here with Medicare, countries with national administrative databases that can determine the cohorts, joining those with air pollution exposure model linked to where people live. And this has been done roughly for everywhere in the world now by multiple groups. And then beginning to try and understand what are the key sources. The air pollution is a mixture. We want to understand how that mixture goes. And doing biomarkers. And another challenge has been that as we've done these larger and larger studies, the levels of air pollution which we see adverse effects have gone lower and lower. And they're down to our Denver bad air, for sure. And if you remember last summer, we had 2 months in a row with unhealthy air on the AQI. And that's because we did, in terms of where we're showing adverse effects, reach into that range. And then a lot of work on mechanisms. This is a paper published in 1981. With apologies to anyone who was born by 1981. This is a study I did that started when I was a fellow. And Frank Spicer, my friend and mentor, walked into my office with a box of bees and said, these are data on emergency room visits and hospitalizations in Steubenville, Ohio. Why don't you look at this? So I didn't know anything about time series analysis. And I kept saying, here's how I'm going to analyze the data. Yvonne Bishop, an author on this, was a very prominent statistician. And I would go to Yvonne and say, here's how I'm going to analyze the data. And she would say, you can't do that. And I was furiously reading books on time series analysis and trying to understand it. So finally I went into it and I said, here's how I'm going to analyze the data I'm going to do it. And I did it. And I did everything wrong by contemporary standards. But I will say the folks at Harvard later took the data set, analyzed it with the latest contemporary GEE, et cetera. The point estimates were exactly as I had estimated. The confidence intervals were a little bit wider. So I felt vindicated. So, and Steubenville is incredibly polluted. You might look at the levels here these are 24-hour values, going up to 700 micrograms per cubic meter. So this is highly polluted. But the point I'm showing you this is that this was the world of little data. Okay, little data can be informative. As a sort of the next step in the evolution, this is the work that my colleagues and I began started while I was at Hopkins. So this is Scott Ziegler and Francesca Domenici, who's gone on to our postdoc and gone on to do big things in this area. And we said, why are we analyzing data from one city at a time? We now have the capability to use multiple, and some of our analyses do want data from cities. Of course, our goal was to look at the relationship between particles and mortality while controlling for all the other sort of time-relevant variables that affect it. So we went on to sort of different data. We were generating a lot of epidemiological and other data on the revolution. So this is just one of those simple PubMed searches with a number of articles, and you can see that we're now in the thousands per year just looking at epidemiology, let alone toxicology, everything else, policy. So what I'm going to do is sort of walk you through the landscape of the kinds of things that we are publishing. And this is where systematic review becomes awfully important, because if you're getting out thousands of studies a year, how can you keep up? I guarantee you I'm making absolutely no effort to keep up with the literature. If I see something that's prominent, I read it, but I wait the next authoritative review so I can look at it. So, going back over time, and if we look at where things were, Denora in the US, London in the UK really launched serious efforts to fund research and to control air pollution. So that's going back to the start. So we had these seminal events that I mentioned that said we need to do something. And then over time, the studies began. This, for example, this study was done by, first off, Ben Ferris, who was at Harvard. He was the original respiratory epidemiologist in the United States. He went to the UK, learned about their methods, and brought them back to the United States. And he's sort of, if you had a family tree of respiratory epidemiologists, here's Ben, and here's my friend Frank Spicer, here am I, and then it keeps going and branching and branching. So Ben went to Berlin, New Hampshire, where there was a paper mill that released sulfur dioxide, and looked at the health there. He brought spirometers to measure lung function in the homes. We began to do things that are commonplace now. In the UK, Waller, Loeffler, and others were looking at what happened in London. This is looking at air pollution in a city street. Who's been on Oxford Street in London? It used to be full of diesel vehicles. It was incredibly polluted. There was a study very common about 8 or 10 years ago where they took people with asthma and walked them down Oxford Street and measured biomarkers before and after, then they walked into a Hyde Park as a comparison. And all these biomarkers lit up after a walk down Oxford Street. Of course, London now has a low emission zone. It's very expensive to get into central London with banning diesel. But so these methods become more sophisticated, but these papers, again, were very important. Here's an early example of a review that Ben Ferris did, and they began to come along as the evidence mounted. The word systematic review is not being used then, at least in the public health world. I think it's probably been launched in the educational world, roughly about that time, if I've got it right. And then these time series studies. So by the mid to 80s and into the early 90s, there was this thought that maybe we had reached safe levels of air pollution. You remember my judgment, we had reached a point where the risks were judged to be acceptable. And then began a wave of daily time series studies in which people looked at day-to-day associations between air pollution levels and mortality. Philadelphia, there were a number of analyses done in Philadelphia. There were about, by 1990, 91, there were about 6 or 7 studies showing associations on a daily basis. Philadelphia, Port Philadelphia had actually collected data that could be used to do these kinds of studies. And we were asked later by EPA, and in fact, as a congressional, we were asked to redo some of these early studies that Scott Ziegler and I redid. And by the time we did our work, there were 7 studies using some Philadelphia data. I actually went up before we published and talked to the environmental health and city commissioners in Philly. It was a great lesson because I went to talk to them, and they said, "You're the first person that has ever talked to us about our data and what you're finding." And it was really, I think it was a great lesson for me, because to me it's obvious to go to Philadelphia and talk to them, but others have not seen the obvious. But these studies came along, and the idea was now we have evidence that maybe the risks are not an acceptable point. So this paper from the Harvard Six City study was published in 1993. It involved 7,000 adults from 6 different cities, including Steubenville, who were followed, and their mortality over a 17-year follow-up period was associated with long-term exposure to radiation. So the study was sort of seminal because it said, well, we're seeing these day-to-day associations. What does that mean for the long term? And people said, well, maybe we're just simply advancing the day of death by some limited period of time. Maybe this 80-year-old was going to die tomorrow but died today. This originally had the unfortunate name of harvesting. And, didn't sit well. It got turned into mortality displacement. But this paper said that this is more extraordinary controversy. It's focused on this. And then this was soon followed by a paper from the American Cancer Society that validated this. These studies were important and sort of linchpin when in 1997, Carol Browder, the administrator of EPA, initiated the PM 2.5 standard that we have. PM 2.5 was not measured before 1997. You've all probably heard of PM 2.5 with smaller particles. So these were important. In fact, again, Congress asked for a redo of these analyses, which was done. This was an analysis that we did in this revalidation of the early time series sets. We rebuilt all the data sets and then analyzed the data. So this is a study that we did where we said, let's use Medicare, which has national coverage, to do a cohort study. I think this was the first of the cohort studies using Medicare. For those of you who work with Medicare data, this was not easy to do because of both getting the data, dealing with the data, managing these very large files, and realigning things for the cohort study we wanted to do. And of course, a number of groups are now using Medicare. Prominent among them, this is a paper that came out in 2017 from the folks at Harvard, the group led by Francesca, that showed now we're getting to extraordinary large populations, millions. The full Medicare database is 65 million roughly at this point, so it can be very large cohort studies. And this one, of course, showed associations going down to contemporary levels of air pollution. And now in the time series world, I said studies have gotten larger. Here's 652 studies and a global pooling exercise. Day-to-day time series. So these studies have now been aided by sort of our ability to handle these very large data sets, and they keep showing effects at air pollution levels we all deal with, which poses a problem. So the evidence is mounted. The evidence is now linked to many, many different adverse health effects. Okay, and if you go through the literature, you will find air pollution PM 2.5 linked to many different things. I mean, again, you know, the lead group, others in ECHO, the ECHO program are looking at PM 2.5, child health, metabolic disturbances. There are other groups here looking with a lot of interesting brain aging, which we're all interested in. Nobody wants their brain to age faster than it might, and so on. So let's go way down now, this paradigm that I talked about. So when I said the steps are clear, they are clear for air pollution because there's a mandate under the Clean Air Act to develop national ambient air quality standards. And if you look at the language carefully, based on such criteria in the Act means evidence. Means evidence. Based on such criteria, so based on the evidence, the administrator is required to do something that's evidence-based. And allowing adequate margin of safety, which has got to be a challenge now, because of the epi I showed you, the requisite to protect public health. So that's the public health burden on the administrator, which is a heavy burden in my mind. So here's the process by which the EPA goes from evidence, research, to action at the end. So a little bit about this paradigm. Before this paradigm, it was something different. The agency is advised on this whole process by something called the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee, which I chaired from 2008 to 2012 as we introduced this paradigm. So we actually worked closely with EPA around how to move forward and what are the steps. So this does involve systematic review in developing something called the integrated science assessment, which is this guy, and then moving on to a risk analysis, and then a policy analysis, and then in the end, the administrator has to make a decision. So in a way, this is the science part. Then we get out here. This is where the context figures in. While I was chair of this committee, one of the big controversies was ozone. Talking about context, the President Obama made the decision not to revise the ozone standard. That's context. And I was actually chair, and luckily I was in an airplane when they were looking for the comment on what the president had done. And I got off the airplane in Panama, and I had a million messages, call this, call that. And then it was past deadline, so nobody cared. So look at what Obama says, and then Samet said. So I can't, but just look at the process. Here is basically the results of a review, a forest plot of results of studies. So here's a process playing out. The agency has calls for criteria to judge the strength of the association. WHO sets their quality guidelines. I was involved in the 2005 guidelines and the ones that came out 2 years ago. And again, now systematic review is fully incorporated into their process. And I'll skip this one, but just say, using this process, we revised the 2005 guidelines to be much more stringent than the most recent because of what the epidemiological evidence showed us. And again, in 2005, we met for a week and redid the guidelines. The next go around, we met for 5 years, did systematic review, and argued about how to get them done in 1 year. Another example of the process is the International Agency for Research on Cancer, or IARC. And again, in 2005, I chaired this, 2013, chaired this group that concluded that air pollution caused cancer and particles did. Again, it's a process. And then a few years ago, I led the group that revised IARC's methodology. And again, laying out a process for taking evidence and integrating it. Lisa Barrow, a member of our faculty of medicine, was involved in this as well. So we continue to refine these processes. So here's the quiz piece. Get ready. What does this mean? 6.7 million deaths are attributable to air pollution. Any takers?
If we got rid of air pollution, we could mitigate 6.7 million deaths.
You're on the right track, and thanks for having courage. So what this means is, if we were to take the air pollution we have now and turn it to some counterfactual, this many premature deaths would be, deaths that are premature would be avoided. And so here's the world as it is, and then there's the counterfactual world. Where I compress the actual distribution of exposure down. And the only point I'll make is these numbers are useful for policy, but they're not real. We use these numbers all the time. The Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, Seattle, grinds them out on an industrial basis. And for air pollution, we put it all together. The numbers are big. That's where that 6.7 million comes from. And then we can map out by country. Okay, yeah, these are useful tools. So, you know, here is Tedros, the head of Director General of WHO, calling air pollution the new tobacco. I actually didn't like that comparison, but we shouldn't have the fights to say whose risk factor is meaner. So the question is then, do these motivate action? We're trying out this locally in the work of the colleagues in Colombia, in Ethiopia, where we set up air pollution monitors about 8 or 9 years ago. And they did burden estimates for Addis Ababa, as one example. We just have another paper press on Nairobi. And so, you know, again, we were able to provide these kinds of estimates for this. So there's been success with air pollution. And, you know, if you look at the United States, particle levels have gone down. Nitrogen dioxide, famous gas stuff, has gone down. Ozone is not the problem here is no, we know that benefits have not accrued. And there's a lot of work on environmental justice. EPA has really strengthened its work and its person power on this. Here is an incredibly complicated slide. Agree? So what it actually shows is that those who generate the pollution receive far less of the exposure than those who don't generate in our society. And it's a very nice analysis, and that's what it shows. So I'm going to, inevitably I talk too much, but Kathy said I could go till 4:30. So what I want to do, so I showed you a paradigm that I think is work that is resulting in cleaner air. Okay, and the air now, and again, those of us with long memories, is far better than it used to be. You know, we have persistent problems. I mean, our environment here in the Front Range is a great example of a real challenge. We have altitude, we have mountains, we have sunlight, we have too many people, too many cars, and we have the energy industry that releases a lot of precursors. So we have a problem. So I showed you this paradigm, so we're going to walk through it. We'll walk through quickly, so I have a little time for discussion at the end. So here's our paradigm. So there's this first question of how do we generate research? Where does it come from? You know, what about the dose response? How do we do all these systematic reviews? Do numbers have leverage? And of course, you know, this big problem of science of this colloquially or big disc. It's true. It's true. I can show you countless examples of this. I don't think I need to. But let's start here about how do we get the right research funded. That may be a challenge. And is the right research what our researchers want to do? I mean, I think, let's face it, if there's funding, somebody will do the research. So let's hope for that. This is a great series of papers in the Lancet some time back about research. And I point out to this is a great figure from this paper about the applicability of knowledge on the x-axis, on the y-axis, the contribution. Where we don't want to be is in that waste quadrant. No knowledge, no application. We have too much stuff there. No way. But for this work, it's sort of in the Dahl quadrant, named after Richard Dahl, of being perhaps maybe not being fundamental advances to knowledge, but being immediate applicability. And that's a lot of what we, I think, do in the air pollution research sector. I will say that I'm going to show you an example where I had the opportunity to actually help direct research and make sure that we're getting the right work done. So after the 1997 fine particle standard, PM2.5 standard was promulgated, there was a lot of controversy. This was back in the important lawsuit, American Truckers et al. Versus Browder, that went up to the Supreme Court. That lawsuit challenged the fundamental right of EPA, in fact, to regulate. If you're not watching the news now, watch very carefully on the Chevron revisit, because that's an extraordinarily important decision for everything our government agencies do. And now this heard yesterday was an argument in the Supreme Court, so stay tuned there. But you know, Christmas Day of 1997, Bruce Alberts, who was the head of the National Academies, called me and said, "We've signed a contract with the EPA to develop a research agenda on particulate matter. And the first report is due at the end of March. And would you chair the committee?" And I guess my problem was I said yes to that and other asks. And what we were asked to do was actually to set the EPA's agenda and its budget on particles. And we did that for 6 years. I bring this example up because it was an example where we were actually in that first box of research generation saying, here's what needs to be generated. And we fit that into a risk paradigm that I'm showing here. So, you know, for all of us who are scientists want to say we'd like to be in charge of the money, suddenly we were. And it's a little bit frightening, in fact. And, you know, we've had regularly with funding. So the point is actually to generate research that fits in the right place, and we had the opportunity to do that. In terms of this next step, doing reviews and understanding causal criteria, this is really an evolutionary area, and particularly challenging for the environment. So in the neat clinical world, where there's lots of somewhat similar comparable clinical trials, they can be stacked up, easily reviewed, and put into meta-analysis. And I apologize, I will simplify it, but it's true. It's compared to very messy environmental data. So we're still struggling here. And I'll only say that I've now chaired about 4 or 5 committees providing guidance to EPA on how to do this and what are the ways to do this and how do we move these methods into the environmental world. One of the big questions is always how do you decide if an environmental agent causes something bad? And that goes back to our whole acceptability risk paradigm. And you know, this doesn't exist. And there's an awful lot of meetings where the experts are sitting around the table saying, well, this study shows, that study shows, confounding error, selection bias there. You know, our whole vocabulary of problems. But in the end, you have to say, is this definitely causal or not? And that conclusion carries implications. If you say something causes something else, you may be opening up an awful lot of stuff to follow. So these are weighty conclusions. You know, we teach in our introductory epi class what Bradford Bill said, and we're still using it in the real world. And, you know, there's this great quote that you ought to remember about all scientific work is incomplete, whether it be observational or experimental. And then at the bottom, we already have, you know, that does not confer upon us the freedom to ignore the knowledge we already have or postpone the action that it appears to demand at a given time. So the cop-out is to say, what? More research is needed, right? And if you say that, that says, well, we don't have enough. And of course, more research is needed is a great line because you can use it in your next grant. But. And again, these are in the Surgeon General's reports as well. So we have approaches, and this inherently relies on judgment. So again, problems with paradigm, question the causal criteria. And in the last administration, of course, the cast of characters changed in many agencies. It changed on the advisory committees. The Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee was chaired by someone who questioned methods that had been set up when I was chair for determining causality. And this, in fact, led to a lot of controversy. And a National Academy committee to look at how EPA was dealing with causality and sort of reaffirm what had been done. So in terms of this panel, this process of what's wrong with the paradigm, again, you could meddle with the process and the steps in the paradigm, and that was sort of what was done in the last administration. Again, I love this thing, which is kind of got a panel of experts. And I'm sure many of you serve on these panels. It sort of comes with our trade in public health. And, again, experts are important. We address what's going on, we provide our viewpoints. Again, who's on panels may determine what comes along. So if the administration changes and advisory panels change, then things may change quickly. And again, who's been on some sort of weighty advisory panel? I suspect a lot of you have. And you sort of know what I'm talking about. There's a real responsibility sitting there to contribute and to make judgments that may have impact. George Comstock is an important figure in epidemiology. Some of you know he has this career span from developing tuberculous skin tests in the 40s to doing modern epidemiology in the 90s. And he was one of my faculty members at Hopkins. We kept having birthday parties. Every time we hit a 0 or 5 birthday, we would have a party for him, which went on until he was 90. And at age 92, he was, as he was unfortunately dying, reviewing manuscripts. But this last quote again is a good one. Judgment in this area depends more on the art of epidemiology, drawing reasonable conclusions from imperfect data. So you don't have to remember what I said, but remember these quotes from these people who said really good things. And then just going through this, in anything in the regulatory world, environment world, the translation world, lots of folks get involved. Again, in our air pollution example, there are an awful lot of different agencies involved. And there's this whole array of people who do things. And if I put this in a global context, you find even more. You find the EU, you find the WHO. And sometimes there are very conflicting findings. It's, again, a source of confusion. Conflicting systematic reviews, very often, which again is a challenge. And then the modeling, and what do you do? And again, my colleague at Hopkins, Alvaro Munoz, is comment about data from history, as they see with many models. Everybody who models knows that you could tweak models to go one way or another. And there's lots of ways to make an association appear or to magically disappear. And again, in our world of conflict and uncertainty about regulation, people may well tweak models to go in one direction or another. It doesn't take necessarily much skill to do that. So the last, just in the real world, there are an awful lot of people who maybe have their hands in the paradigm. I mean, a great example is this decision about Chevron, this Chevron, previous Chevron guidelines doctrine, which may really change the regulatory world. So, interfering, generating bad science. This is a paper I wrote with my friend Tom Burke about the passive smoking story, turning science into junk. The tobacco industry and passive smoking, where there was a many decades, several decades effort, concerted, well-funded, organized, to undermine the science all the way across the paradigm. All the way across the paradigm. The tobacco industry convened its own panels to judge causality. They wrote papers about why you can't do meta-analysis on secondhand smoke studies, and more. So, again, they sort of brought out the standard litany of stuff. They turned everyone inside out and said all that might be good is actually bad. And this was part of the fraud case, the Department of Justice case. Judge Kessler wrote a remarkable opinion about what they did. They did I think she powerfully captured just how wrong and essentially immoral they were. You know, in terms of this context, this is a paper I wrote with Tom Berkman and Bernie Goldstein at the start of the last administration. And again, you know, we wrote what you would expect, and all my friends wrote and said, what a great piece, which means I failed, because only my friends were reading. And then again, you know, that's the problem now. So this is a quote from it: scientific evidence does not change administration change. Context did change. And then again, you know, this problem of how do we deal with context in our science. I'm just going to end, I mean, probably the most, in a way, severe form of air pollution we're facing now is greenhouse gas contamination, global climate change, and all its consequences. And again, so we're back in our paradigm. So, you know, this comes from this Lancet Commission. People have said a lot of this sort of thing. I can't draw you a diagram that says how the evidence that we are going to generate, how the evidence from our rising interest in the School of Climate and Health is going to make a difference. NIH is now funding research on climate and health, which is great. Where is it going to make a difference? Can anybody draw the line diagram that says we're saying that more people die of heat, wildfire smoke, there'll be climate migration, food insecurity, you know, you can go down the list. So I'm not sure what the paths are. So I'll just end with this quote. I think it's very difficult, especially about things that I don't think Neil Bohr actually said that. We tried to trace this years ago, including contacting the Niels Bohr Museum in Copenhagen, and they said, yes, this was attributed to him, but that's probably not correct. I guarantee the attribution to Yogi Berra is correct. So thanks for the opportunity to give the Dean's lecture, Kathy D, or Dean Kathy, and I appreciate having a chance to tell you about some of the things I've been doing over the years. So thanks.
John, would you like to take a few questions for a bit, and then everybody can get out of this very warm room?
Yeah, so really interesting, kind of your whole diagram there. Can you speak kind of a little bit about the Bradford Hill criteria and maybe a little bit about the precautionary principle? Because I mean, particularly for emerging things, we don't have all that evidence, but we can make some pretty good.
Right. So, you know, I'm sure probably most of you are familiar with the precautionary principle, but the idea that knowledge is incomplete, that you force actions towards being precautionary in the face of uncertainty, and there's responsibility to address the gaps in evidence, in fact, that lead to the uncertainty. And I think, you know, the precautionary principle to me is a very reasonable one in many circumstances, and whether we exercise it at the individual level or at the societal level. And that goes back to that definition of acceptable risk, because if you don't know what the risks are, you can't make the judgment of safety. And then you want to err on the side of doing what seems to be safe. And your other question was about Bradford Hill.
Yeah, I think they go together a little bit.
A little bit, but you know, what we lack, I mean, what Hill did, actually the 61st Surgeon General, I've always sort of thought of the Hill paper was published in 65. The Surgeon General's report was 64 and actually had very similar criteria because they were quite reasonable. And they are basically, I think, integrative approaches. It's not a checklist, and that's appropriate. It's a set of guidelines for interpreting evidence, and are necessarily applied by people. I haven't seen the AI application of that criteria yet. Perhaps we're heading there. Who knows? I mean, you know, maybe that would be useful if we had the right tools to scour all the literature, but, they're in part to help us bring all the evidence together. I've always recommended people that if you want to see wholesale application of this, go read the 1964 Surgeon General Statement. It's about 330 pages, 3/4. It's about 330 pages. And actually, you can see how they applied this, integrated the evidence. And I still think it's probably one of the first systematic reviews of public health. Somebody else tried to write a paper about that. So I think really, so where the challenges come is that sometimes it's subjective, it doesn't involve experts. And, if you're looking at smoking and lung cancer, sure. And then, you can go from there to whatever pollutant you want or agent or whatever it is, where the evidence is far more gray and then you have to sort it out. I think Michael.
Going back to, that was a great quote you put up by Lawrence about the risk of the Nelson judge was accepted. And, in the future, right now, like in cancer prevention and environmental health, we tend to think, the stated goal for public health protection is the risk that's in the 1 to 10,000, the 1 in a million excess risk. And for non-cancer endpoints, we often say we're going to protect the 95th percentile receptor, right? But we acknowledge, acknowledge can't protect everybody, right? We're going to protect the 95th percentile. Do you see that these are going to stay with it? I mean, is there consensus on this? Do you think? I tend to think there is, but I don't know if it will change, and I don't know, John, when we start understanding who's vulnerable with all the genomic knowledge that's going to take place within not too long a distance. So some people may have a very high risk and others may not. How is this whole pattern?
And of course, probably most of you see the words precision public health, which in a way is what Michael is getting at. And, if you could sort of look and say, oops, I'm a bad metabolizer of external, whatever it is. This question, in part, so those of you who live in the regulatory world, there are certain bright lines that come in part through court cases, tradition, and other things. And these get meddled with, the value of human life, for example. So I think these things will, they're inevitably going to change, I think. And I think they will change slowly. Some of them, in terms of changing these numbers in the regulatory process, changing the value of human life, for example, has a huge impact on cost benefit analysis. So again, in terms of sort of meddling to sway things one way or another, that may happen. So I think the only answer is probably stay tuned. If we begin to profile risks in populations on a genetic basis, then we could come to some very interesting new ideas about what the distribution is exactly.
Well, and just to comment on that topic, I think once you get down to individualized medicine, the aspect of personal responsibility comes into play. If I know I'm at high risk, it's not the public health industry's, area's responsibility to keep me safe. If I shouldn't be consuming something, it's my responsibility too. So I would hope that comes into play.
Well, it's going to be interesting. I mean, that goes back to who's making these choices. And there are lots of interesting questions. You might go read the story about folate supplementation and the question of trade-offs and risks potentially around cardiovascular disease and prevention of neural tube defects. And there's a lot of discussion of that sort and some related to specific aspects of metabolism. But I certainly agree that a sharper and certain enough profiling of individual risk, if we get there, could lead to an awful lot of questions and concerns about how we manage those risks, whether as individuals or as a society.
So I recall when David Savitz was here, he said something very similar to what you said today, which is we should be setting our research priorities according to the evidence we need in order to take action. And I think I would say that, NIH doesn't necessarily set their research priorities that way. And most of us, of course, get our money from NIH. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about, how we would push, or could we push towards setting research priorities in sort of a more sensible way for public health action.
Yeah, it's interesting, the 6 city study actually came about, it was funded by NIHS. And it came about during the sort of the fuel shocks in the roughly 73-4, when these energy shocks. And there was a lot of discussion about more and more coal-burning power plants being built, and concern about sort of sulfur oxides and particles being generated. The idea was to set up a multi-site study that could try and understand this, and some of the cities were picked on that basis. That was a decision that actually came from the then director. And you're right. I mean, NIH, we go to a so-called hypothesis-driven research, don't we? And if we have an applied goal, we try and describe it. I mean, there's usually something about impact, right? And we say, well, I'm going to answer this critical question about biomarkers of air pollution, and this will also be relevant to protection of children's health through whatever. I mean, I suspect people in this room have written that sentence. So you're right. And what was unique about the example I showed you, where we were able to actually influence EPA funding, which is of course not NIH, but has a very applied mandate, that actually worked. And again, I think this, a useful case study, not now, but in a few years, will be the NIH-wide Climate and Health Initiative funding, because then we can sort of chart what was funded and see what it is, what it generates, and how it makes the difference. And right now, there's an awful lot of sort of scenario-based modeling going on around climate and health. I might almost argue enough for some things. And then the question is, now then, so what inevitably arises if who's going to deal with it. So maybe somebody here can do that follow-up on the climate and health work. And I think Allie just came on the point.
So at what point, we talk about research priorities, at what point does research priority pivot to not are there bad health effects, but how do we mitigate exposure? Should that be done in parallel? I mean, at some point in that trajectory.
Yeah, so, there are a couple comments, but so public health intervention, I think we're left with studying the consequences of interventions and whether they made a difference. And, there are good examples, and I've put together a group on so-called accountability for the Health Facts Institute, which does air pollution research, which was about 20 years ago. They followed up looking at things like, does implementation of coal burning ban have benefits for health? Now, so that's studying intervention after it's happened. The kinds of interventions that people are looking at around the environment, air cleaning, okay, studies of air cleaning in homes of people with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, good examples of trying to understand the health benefits of interventions that are personal. That's far different from looking at whether the closure of coal-fired power plants benefits surrounding communities or chemical plants. So I do think there are examples where we should try and understand what the consequences are. And people are doing those sorts of analyses. I mean, there's lots of designs that are sort of Glenn's world, these different designs, and others of the quasi-experimental world, to look at those consequences of those kinds of interventions. These air cleaner trials and behavioral interventions have been funded by NIH. So those have been funded by NIH. And then there's this broader body of research looking at the consequences of real-world interventions. It can be done if the right data sets are there, but the data mechanism, the collection mechanism in general have to be in place so you can do these sorts of things.
Yeah, I was going to ask a question going back to joint causal conclusions. I mean, you gave some examples, and then I've come across other sort of causal criteria laid out by National Academy of Sciences, for different topics like vaccine safety issues and all of that,
Sure.
right? So I just don't know, like, a question I always have is, different committee, even following the same framework, will they reach the same or different causal conclusions? So what type of uncertainty, how do you exercise uncertainty when you're drawing those causal conclusions? And you probably have examples where, different bodies of committees
Yeah.
looking at the same evidence, even systematic reviews,
Right.
would reach very different causal conclusions.
Right. So, it's a great question, and, who's on the panel, maybe what you get, there's very little empiric work. I mean, I'm aware of a couple of papers in the epidemiological literature sort of doing this kind of work and how much influences there are of the panel. I don't think I know of anyone who said, well, what if we use these criteria versus a different set of criteria? I can tell you, if you go to EPA, which has multiple groups, because of statutes, doing multiple systematic reviews, using different methodologies, different causal criteria, and then you go, how come even within one agency, they can't do things? And for those of you who go to National Academy to the panels, they make often reach very important conclusions. Again, there's no sort of standard operating procedure manual that you turn to for judging causality. And in a way, it's shocking. And there's no sort of preparation of experts to make these judgments. And again, I think that you realize the import of conclusions. So I was one of the editors of the 1986 Surgeon General's report, which is Edward Koop's report on passive smoking. The first conclusion is involuntary smoking is a cause of disease, including lung cancer, in healthy non-smokers. Conclusion number one. And believe me, when we wrote that, we knew that we were writing a conclusion with extraordinary import. You can't sit there and say passive smoking causes lung cancer in non-smokers and not realize that in that paradigm, a lot of things should follow, and they did follow. But it's a position that some of us may end up in, and I think then you have to really be prepared to be able to apply. I'm not going to critique the Bradford Hill criteria, because I think they're just fine for integrating evidence. I never opposed anything else, and I think they make sense, which is probably a good criteria to say they're okay, and we've been using them.
The 2017 integrated science assessment for ozone, I think, also developed a whole new approach.
Yeah.
Or maybe it was before 2017.
Yeah,
but it was
after paradigm that shifted in 2008.
Yeah, and
Right.
that's good too.
Yeah, so that was the whole shift that we did back when I was case secretary, and got questioned in the prior administration. We're gonna have a long conversation.
Yeah. So before everyone knows, there are refreshments and water and things for the next room, and also we're going to be honoring John with recognition for his service to our school. So thank you, John.
Good.